to the fact that we already mean. How you know what we know. This is the problem with semiotics. How you feel what we feel. Not the idea to collect science, meaning of science, and to put that together. We will never solve the question.
The world of goods, the world of commodities, and you've written a book on that. You know, Marx says that a commodity is a mysterious thing. I mean, what is the mystique of the commodity?
Well, people get looking at the commodity instead of at the person's relations. That's what the anthropologist notices, that all this theorizing in the humanities and in the social sciences about commodities treat commodities as if they had a life of their own. Even this conference on objects, people are fixated upon the objects, instead of looking at streams of objects being used by people to mark each other's relationships to each other. I coined the term marking services for that book, and said that you really need commodities to give each other marking services, to pay respect, to pay tribute, to pay honor to each other, or to grade each other in degrees of honor, which is also necessary if you want to pay honor to somebody more than the rest, if you want to make an outstanding honorable claim. And I think that's the real semiotic aspect of my work. Is that what you were asking me before? It should be a critique of power and exclusion, and of excuses for doing it, and of using objects as excuses for doing it too, you see. So if you talk about the objects or about the beliefs without reference to the excluding and marginalizing processes, you're being frivolous, I think.
We haven't really got into another key insight of the Birmingham School, the decoding. This is something else that needs to be studied, the way people use and can self-valorize the products of popular culture. There's a tendency in the Frankfurt School to have too much of a manipulation model in which you simply analyze the messages, the ideologies, and you assume the audience is indoctrinated, that it simply passively reproduces the ideas, the forms of behavior that are disseminated through the media industry, whereas the possibility of cultural resistance on the form of the audience, on behalf of the audience, the possibility of the decoding of the media product in a way against the intentions of the producers of this thing is an important insight that again goes back to the Birmingham School. At least I first got this position from the very early Stuart Hall paper on encoding, decoding. So this is an important element of a critical approach to cultural studies, but you can go too far in this sort of celebrations of the use and gratifications of popular culture, and you can lose your critical thrust. Certain theorists, I think, have gone too far in that direction, overreacting against the Frankfurt School and over-exaggerating the extent to which individuals can decode in their own autonomous ways that makes popular culture thus more harmless and just simply more fun and less potent.
But I suppose for me, uses and gratifications has always been fundamentally problematic on two separate counts. I mean, firstly, this notion of messages being kind of completely open to any kind of use that anybody wants to make of them, frankly, I just think it is inadequate, because I don't think it's true. You know, of course, anybody can, at a certain point, read against the grain of a film or a program or whatever, but some readings are easier to make than others. You know, films are shot from the point of view of a hero or a heroine, like where the camera is positioned or whatever it is, yeah? So, for me, that's why I prefer Voloshinov's concept of multi-accentuality, which gives you a notion of a struggle over meaning, but a struggle between definite forces, which are pulling the meaning of a word this way or that way, rather than the notion of polysemy in a kind of Barthesian usage, because for me, and a lot of that ends up back with the uses and gratifications, you know, from word to text, the idea that you can make anything out of anything. I just think that fails to deal with the way in which messages are structured by systems of control, ownership, and so on, which articulate themselves as professional practices. The second problem with uses and gratifications is insofar as it gives you a notion, the ability to deal with difference, it's only individual difference. Yes, it can deal with our, you know, the differences in the way in which you might see Godfather 3 as opposed to I might see it, qua kind of individuals, yeah? And yes, of course, there'll always be those kinds of differences, but it doesn't allow you to say anything about cultural differences and senses in which we both, as white men, actually might tend to be involved in certain kinds of things and cultural codes and forms of cultural capital which other people would not share with us, or whatever, or our differences, as Canadian or English or whatever. So, for me, the crucial shift there was to move away from a notion of individual differences of reading and to start to introduce a notion of cultural differences and cultural patternings of interpretation, which themselves, as a sociologist, I always want to locate by reference to social structure and social divisions.
Yes, well, I think there are probably two dimensions we need to look at least two. The first is that the so-called text, what we used to call texts or cultural commodity or whatever, should not be seen as a singular art object on the one hand, nor as simply an ideological agent or as an agent of commodification on the other. Rather, it is a resource, some aspects of which, some elements of which will be taken up and activated and others will not. And while the structure of the text itself is not totally open, it's not a completely unstructured resource, nonetheless, the structure of the text cannot determine finally which elements are taken up by which formations of the people and made into popular culture. So we need to analyse texts not for their coherence and structure, but rather for their contradictions, their gaps, the opportunities that they offer, because that's where popular culture is made. In those contradictions, in the gaps, in the fractures, the weaknesses in the text, if you like. So it's a different form of textual analysis. And then I think we need some form of analysis of socially specific practice by which we can find instances of this potential of the text actually being actualized, taken up, meanings made, pleasures made that are specific to a certain formation of the people.
Culture as being the site of fun and pleasure. I mean, the power of popular culture is indeed that, is it not?
Right, but you know, wife beating may be fun, fascism is fun, torture and murder may be fun for sadists. That valorizing popular culture as good per se, simply because it produces pleasure, I think is the worst approach to popular culture. That goes back to an early bourgeois theorist by this guy Stevenson of uses, gratifications, pleasures of popular culture. You need to distinguish between sort of good and bad pleasures. Pleasures that encode certain ideologies that lead to sadomasochistic, sexist, racist behavior, or pleasures in gratifications of eroticism, pleasure in community, in solidarity, in individual self-valorization, etc., that seems to be sort of progressive, emancipatory kinds of pleasures. I think one needs to distinguish and discriminate between the messages, the pleasures of popular culture, and quite frankly, you need a normative theory and a political theory to be able to make these kinds of discriminations, and I think it's an important part of the critical project, at least, to do this.
Well, pleasure is certainly an extremely strong motivation. I mean, if there is no pleasure in this process of cultural production or reproduction, then why on earth should anyone engage in it? It's not, the people can't engage in it for direct economic gain. They can't engage in it for, they can't sort of cash it in for immediate material gain. So the gain in pleasure that goes with a sense of self-control, or at least of control over some of the conditions of one's existence, while it doesn't explain everything that's going on, I think it's certainly a very powerful motivator for people to engage in this business of the production of popular culture.
Wouldn't pleasure also be hooked up with ideology?
Oh, well, that's a different sort of pleasure entirely. That's pleasure as the sort of bait on the hook of ideology, a top-down pleasure that tries to organise the responses of the people. And of course there is a certain degree of pleasure in aligning oneself with the forces of power, with the forces of ideology. But that to me is a pleasure of the dominant, it's a hegemonic pleasure, and it's certainly not a popular pleasure. So we're talking about quite different orders of pleasure here. Popular culture is solidly located in the here and now, of which the body becomes the most physical presence of the here and now. So the body in popular culture is always very important, yes.
And it brings in also the Foucauldian argument as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
About the discipline of it.
Yeah, sure. Bakhtinian arguments about the indiscipline of the popular carnivalesque body, Foucauldian arguments about how the disciplinary mechanisms try and control and organise the body. So yes, and I think this is one of the significant shifts in cultural theory within the last generation, is much more the emphasis has shifted away from how does ideology work, how is ideology controlled, to much more how does the body work, how is the body controlled, not just the body of the individual, but the body of the people, the social body, the body politic. And so there's this emphasis has moved much more, I think, towards material bodies in material places and material behaviours, rather than the much more abstract immaterial theories that of a generation before, which I don't want to put down because I was part of it. You know.